Okay, hi everybody. I hope you're all doing great out there. I thank you for watching. And in this video, we're going to tackle the topic of immigration and deal with the issue of whether or not legitimate states have the right to exclude. This will be part one of a two-part series where we'll look at someone who argues that legitimate states do have the right to exclude, and then we'll look at somebody else who argues that that legitimate states do not have the right to exclude. So we'll begin with you might say, the right to have closed borders view developed by Christopher Heath Wellman in a 2020 paper, Refugees and the Right to Control Immigration. Okay, there are other places where he defends this position. Um, and just brief bit about Heath Wellman. He's a professor of philosophy, teaches ethics, political, and legal philosophy at the Washington University in St. Louis. As a prominent figure in his field. And let's just dive to the paper. It seems like there's two main theses that we can draw out of the paper. The Heath Wellman piece, it reads pretty straightforwardly. So hopefully you were able to gather these theses. But thesis one, as I have on the slide, is that legitimate states have the right to self-determination. And this is going to imply or entail having the right to exclude would-be immigrants, or this would imply having the right to have closed borders policies, is another way of putting the point. And then thesis two is that, as we'll see, is the right to exclude would-be immigrants usually applies even in the case of refugees. So we'll see toward the end of our discussion that today, that Heath Wellman concludes his discussion of his defense of his position by dealing with a potential objection to his argument that rests on thinking about the obligations that legitimate states have to refugees, which would seem to compromise legitimate states having the right to or robust rights to self-determination. Okay, but that'll come in a bit later. We're going to focus on thesis one for quite a bit here. And here's our self-determination argument, as we'll call it. So SDA, um, in line with thinking about thesis one as we just laid out. And here's a way of capturing the argument, hopefully intuitively. This is an attempt to present an intuitive sketch of Heath Wellman's main argument. And it goes like this: since the legitimate state's right to self-determination entails its right to free association, and since the right to free association entails its right to exclude would-be immigrants, a legitimate state's right to self-determination entails its right to exclude would-be immigrants. So there's a lot of rights talk there, and a lot of entailment rights there. When we think about entailment, think about it necessarily implies, if that's helpful. Okay, so that's my way of capturing the argument in a rather sketch-like manner, in a hopefully intuitive way. And if it's not intuitive, reading it for the first time or hearing it for the first time, I recommend pausing the video and giving it a read until it makes sense. Let's turn to page 287 of the Heath Wellman. So you've probably noted here that this paper is found in a work called The Ethical Life by Rush Schaefer Landau. Excellent text for those of you interested in a lot of applied ethics topics. Even theoretical ethical topics are found in the work. But it was commissioned for the fifth edition of The Ethical Life. It's also in the sixth edition. So publications are 2021 and 2024 on that front. What we're given here on page 287, the first page of Heath Wellman's essay, these introductions are real nice that Rush for Landau provides. So I recommend reading those. They'll really, I think, help you understand big picture what's going on in the papers that I assign. But Heath Wellman writes, my argument for legitimate states' right to exclude others is built on three foundational premises. Legitimate states are entitled, one, legitimate states are entitled to self-determination. Two, freedom of association is an integral component of self-determination, which I've understood as freedom of association is entailed by self-determination. And three, freedom of association entitles one to refuse to associate with others as one sees fit. Or freedom of association entails that one can refuse to associate with whomever one wants, as one might put it that way. Okay, and then from 1 to 3, we're able to arrive at the conclusion that legitimate states would have the right to refuse to associate with, would-be immigrants. Okay, and thus have the right to have closed borders policies. So I present the argument in a sketch-like manner, somewhat differently, but I think it captures the spirit of what uh, Heath Wellman's up to here on the first page of his essay, page 287 in the text. Okay, so SDA, so the self-determination argument, three uncontroversial claims that were made or otherwise assumed in the intuitive sketch uh, here on slide 4. So here on slide 5, three uncontroversial claims, meaning that, and this is Heath Wellman claiming this as well. One, it's uncontroversial that individuals have the right to self-determination. It's uncontroversial that the right to self-determination entails a right to free association. Okay. Um, or that the right to free association is an integral component to the right to self-determination. Okay. And three, it's uncontroversial that the right to free association entails the right to not associate. Okay. And Wellman's example, or Heath Wellman's example, I gotta remember it's Heath Wellman. Sorry about that. Heath Wellman's example is found early on in the text. He says, it's difficult to establish the truth of the second and third premises. What I'm trying to say here is it's not easy to establish because it's uncontroversial. To see that freedom of association is integral to self-determination, and that enjoying freedom of association requires that one be free to refuse to associate with others. One need only imagine, or we need only imagine a setting in which one's father, say, has sole discretion to choose who his children marry through some form of arranged marriage or some such. Whatever one might think of this type of arrangement, it clearly does not respect rights to self-determination. Freedom of association involves more than merely the right to get married. It includes the right to reject any and all suitors who prefer not to marry. So people can agree that self-determination, right? Or you might say the right to marry whomever one wants is going to follow from having the right to self-determination. So you self-determine in a way by choosing who you're going to marry. Okay? Um, but then, of course, what seems to be entailed by having the right to self-determination is having the right to freely associate. Well, in this case, freely associate with the person um, um, you're going to marry, let's say. So let's think about um, um, the case of marriage again. Self-determination is going to entail having the right to marry whomever one wants. But of course, that means that the individual who's getting married has the right to free association with that individual that they're going to marry. But it's not just being able, the right to self-determination, right to free association, isn't just having the right to freely associate. It's also having the right not to associate with some. Okay, and so there might imagine someone who has several suitors. Well, they can exclude association with or avoid association with uh, all but one of the suitors. So as Heath Wellman writes, freedom of association involves more than merely the right to get married. It includes the right to reject any and all suitors one prefers not to marry. And this explains why those of us who value individual autonomy take such offense at the thought of institutions which bestow upon parents the authority to force spouses on their children. And so this is how 1 through 3 are developed in the text. Heath Wellman's example is the marriage example. Okay. Okay, so a paradigmatic way in which we exercise the right to self-determination is by getting married. But of course, that involves freely associating with the person whom we're going to marry. And of course, this involves this involves having the right to um, exclude or avoid relations with those whom we don't want to marry. Okay. So, but there is a controversial claim, though, in SDA, in the self-determination argument. And it's um, that corporate political entities, legitimate states, international organizations, et cetera, have the right to self-determination. So it's at least initially controversial that corporate political entities have the right to self-determination. Okay. Um, so an argument is needed here um, to deal with this controversial claim. So if the easy case is the individual case and thinking about self-determination and the entailing right to free association and the entailing right to exclude, well, the controversial claim is, well, that self-determination and these entailing rights applies also or apply also to corporate political entities. Page 288, as we're going to see from the Heath Wellman. So he says, well, while few, but while few deny that individuals have a right to freedom of association in the marital realm, and perhaps many others, but this is the paradigmatic case we're dealing with here. Some may question whether corporate political entities, legitimate states, are the types of things that could have such a right. Okay, to see that states are entitled to an analogous sphere of political self-determination. Think of a country like Norway and its relations with Sweden and the European Union. Okay, so here we're going to try to look at the argument. Okay, so what's Heath Wellman's argument going to be here, or what's his example going to be here in order to deal with this controversial claim? Again, the individual case is clear, but what about the legitimate state case? Well, consider a legitimate state like Norway. Okay, Norway is currently an associate member of the EU, and it enjoys close relations with Sweden, the country from which it seceded in 1905. Heath Wellman, just as a bracket here, which may interest you, has done significant work on the right to succession. Okay, anyways, I'll set that aside. But now imagine that Sweden, inspired perhaps by the reunification of Germany, wanted to reunite with Norway, or that the EU wanted Norway to become a full member. So Norway is an associate member, but it's not a complete or full member um, um, of the EU. Um, would Sweden or the EU have the right to unilaterally annex Norway, or to be impermissible for them to do so without Norway's consent? That seems pretty straightforward, right? It seems clear that neither Sweden nor the EU is morally entitled to forcibly annex Norway. Okay. Okay. Any more than Putin is morally entitled to forcibly annex Ukraine. Okay. Or press for that Crimea. Okay. But I don't want to get too bogged down in the current events and thinking about this topic, although they are quite relevant to the immigration issue. Um, if you want to talk about those, we can. Instead, I'm sort of thinking about sort of the philosophical side of things and dealing with the empirical at this sort of philosophical higher level, you might say. So this is an empirical example, and it seems to capture what Heath Wellman needs it to capture. And it's that Norway has self-determination, it has the right to free association, it has the right to not associate, has a right to exclude. It does not have to become a full member of the EU. It does not have to be part of Sweden again. Okay. Okay. There's more that I could read here, but I'll go ahead and go back to the slides. And I encourage you to read the entire text. It'll help you definitely with the reading. But you know, so here I've kind of dealt with a sketch of the self-determination argument, and then dealt with three uncontroversial claims that we made in it, and then one controversial claim in it, because we apply the self-determination right and then the other rights that are entailed by it to legitimate states. And now we kind of at least initially dealt with the issue of whether or not it's it's fine to connect self-determination and these other entailing rights to legitimate states, despite the fact that it's uncontroversial that they apply to the individuals. Okay, but now we're in a position to look at the argument in a bit more detail, where we could sketch it out. So that way we're understanding how we get to the conclusion that legitimate states have the right to restrict immigration. Okay, because you might think that there's some gaps in how things have been presented, and this is really to help those of you out who just feel like you need a little bit more in terms of filling in gaps. So what's going to be the argument fleshed out. So step one. So just work with me through this, and I think this will help you with understanding the argument that Heath Wellman is trying to run. And then we'll identify, really the crucial premise or premises in the argument. And hopefully you'll be able to figure that out yourself. So number one, if individuals have the right to self-determination, then so do legitimate states. And I have NMD here for no moral difference, or no relevant difference if you want, NRD. Okay, there's no moral difference, there's no relevant difference, there's no morally relevant difference. So NMRD, if you want to call it that. Okay. Okay. Um, so that's what's going to connect the antecedent with the consequent in one in this conditional sentence. Two is just to assert the antecedent of one, individuals have the right to self-determination. Remember, that's the easy case. So we're supposed to move from one, the antecedent giving us the easy case, to the case that, remember, was questionable or was at least slightly controversial, as we talked about already. Okay. So individuals have the right to self-determination. And here, just think about the marriage example again, if that's helpful. Okay. Individuals have the right to choose who they marry and thus self-determine. Okay. And therefore, legitimate states have the right to self-determination. So that's just going to follow from 1 and 2. And logic, the relevant logic is modus ponens. Okay. So I've taught you modus ponens already, but it's where you have if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, where P's and Q's just stand for as variables for sentences, which are the values that we're giving them. But that's the form, you might say, of 1 through 3 is modus ponens, and we know that that's logically good. Okay, so we say it's logically valid, meaning that if 1 and 2 are true, 3's got to be true. So then we move from 3 to 4 and say something about the right to self-determination. Well, it entails right to freedom of association. Okay, we've seen that. Okay, we know that freedom of association is entailed by or integral component of the right to self-determination, as Heath Wellman puts it. And that's just a premise in the argument, okay? An uncontroversial one, okay? As again, the marriage example shows, the person who has the right to self-determine who they marry, has the right to associate with the person who they marry, boom. 5, the right to freedom of association tells the right to refuse to associate with others. Again, run the marriage example, if you will, here. And once again, the person who has the right to freely associate with their beloved has the right to refuse association with those whom they don't love, or those whom they don't want to marry. Okay, that's number 5. And uncontroversial. It's a premise. It's an uncontroversial premise. And then 6, therefore, the right to self-determination entails right to refuse to associate with others. Okay. So here we're just moving from 4 to 5 to 6 logically. And so 4 and 5, and the logical principle or logical rule of inference called hypothetical syllogism is in place here. Okay. And so we could easily convert 4 and 5 to conditional sentences, hypothetical sentences. If X has the right to self-determination, then they have the right. X has the right to freedom of association. If X has the right to freedom of association, then then X has the right to refuse to associate with others. Therefore, if X has the right to self-determination, then they have the right to associate with others, or the right to refuse to associate with others. Excuse me. So, so 4 and 5 in logic, yet a 6. And 7, therefore, legitimate states have the right to refuse to associate with others. This is by 3 and 6 in logic, because all we're doing is we're applying legitimate states to 6. So we know that 6 is going to apply nicely to individuals, but given that we've established 3, then it looks like we could say that legitimate states also have the right to self-determination, which then entails they have the right to refuse to associate with others. That's how we get to number 7. Okay, so we apply 3 to 6. You might even say that what we've done with 7 is just provide an instance of 6, the case of legitimate states being the relevant instance. And then 8, therefore, legitimate states have the right to exclude others. This just follows by 7 because the way in which a legitimate state could have the right to refuse to associate with others is by excluding outsiders. Okay, just like in the marriage case, just like in the Norway case, Norway doesn't have to um, um, uh, associate with, let's say, Sweden in the relevant way, or with the EU in the relevant way. So it has the right to exclude those outsiders. And then if it has the right to exclude outsiders, if legitimate states have the right to exclude outsiders, then um, then they have the right to restrict immigration. Okay. So other outsiders could be other political states, international organizations, or individuals. Okay. So that's the argument, and I know it's a lot, but I'm trying to move carefully from how we get from states having number 3, states having the right to self-determination, to states, legitimate states have the right to restrict immigration and thus have closed borders policies. That'd be, if we were to go to number 10, we could include that. Okay. Oops. So now we're in a position to look at objections and replies, which Heath Wellman does in his paper. So if you've noticed on page 289 at the top, he after giving the Norway example, um, and giving us reason to think that, intuitive reason for thinking that Norway is like individuals in a relevant way, and the fact that it has right to self-determine, thus the right to freely associate, and the right to not associate, the right to exclude. And then he writes on top of page 289, important paragraph, your first full paragraph, because he ends up spending a lot of time dealing with the potential objections laid out in this paragraph. He writes, here, 2 potential objections present themselves. First, it may strike some as misleading to compare having discretion over one's partner in marriage to the selection of potential immigrants, because having control over one's associates is plainly paramount or plainly significant in marital relations, and relations like this we could add if we wanted, but seems of little consequence within the relatively impersonal context of political life. There's something too lacking in intimacy for the analogy between individuals and legitimate states having self-determination. Okay. And then, so that's the first objection. The second one is, second, even if we concede that a legitimate state's right to freedom of association applies in relation to other countries or international institutions, so think about Norway in relation to Sweden, that'd be another country, or international institutions, that would be the EU or the UN or something like that. This seems quite different from alleging that large political regimes enjoy freedom of association, which, remember, drops out of having self-determination with respect to individual foreigners. Okay, and if that's the case, then it can't be concluded that legitimate states would thereby have the right to have closed borders policies against would-be immigrants. Okay, so maybe that went by kind of quick, but I wanted to show you the relevant passage where the initial set of objections and replies develops, and Heath Wellman spends a lot of time on those. So here's a way of capturing objection 1. I call it the lack of intimacy objection, just to give it a name. Okay. I call it that because I think in the next paragraph, he writes, in response to the first worry, I admit that freedom of association is considerably more important in intimate relations. Okay, so I'm just following his terminology here a little bit to give this first objection a tag. So the right to free association is more important in relationships between individuals, remember, paramount significance, than in relationships between individuals or foreigners and states, because the former are more intimate while the latter are more impersonal. Okay, or too impersonal. Okay, so that's, I think, a way of capturing the objection. Okay. Trying to capture a significant moral difference, right, between legitimate states on the one hand and individuals on the other, as far as self-determination or the right to free association is concerned. If we go back to the argument, it would look like the challenge is most explicitly to one. Okay. So if individuals have the right to self-determination, then so do legitimate states. This challenge would seem to say, no, individuals do have that self-determination and free association, right? Think about the marriage case, the intimacy case. Um, but legitimate states don't have the right to self-determination or therefore the right to free association because, well, legitimate states are too impersonal in their relationships to would-be foreigners or would-be immigrants, excuse me, foreigners or would-be immigrants. Okay, so that's the target for objection one is premise one as we've noted it. Okay, really in line with the with what we were considering the the controversial claim of SDA, the self-determination argument by Heath Wellman. But what's the reply? What are the replies to objection one? Because if you've read the text, you see that what happens is we get significant replies all the way up to page 291. The second full paragraph is where he picks up the second objection, and then, or I should say, response to the second objection. So we spent some time thinking about what he wants to say, and I'll try to capture an outline of what he captures. So the first reply, R1, as I'm calling it, R1 for reply one. Even if the right to free association is more important in relationship between individuals, right, because they can be more intimate, remember, um, um, than in relations between individuals and states, they're too impersonal. This doesn't imply that states don't have the right to free association in relation to individuals. Okay, right? Legitimate states may well have a very robust right. Indeed. So the fact that, um, 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 uh, and it seems like it is a fact because Heath Wellman's happy to consent the point that free association is more important in some sense in the relationship between individuals. So I suppose individual on individual compared to states and individuals in their relationship to each other. It just doesn't follow that that it being more significant in the case of individuals in relation to individuals rules out there being a right at all between um, um, uh, states in relation to individuals. Okay, so that's at least the first reply, sort of this big picture reply to say, okay, there still very well might be a right that a state has. Again, in relation to an individual, and the relevant individuals would be the would-be immigrants and the foreigners. Okay, and maybe a way of seeing this is captured by what I'm calling R2 or reply to. Consider the golf league example that Heath Wellman deals with here. I'll try to just capture what I see him doing there, and the caption is that there's a lack of intimate relations between the golf league and individuals who would want to join it. And if golf leagues doesn't work for you, consider some other league, okay, or some other organization, some other club. Um, the example that Keith Wellman uses involves thinking about golf leagues. So there very well may be a very impersonal relationship between the golf league and the individual who would want to join the golf league. Still, the golf league has a robust right, doesn't it, to self-determination, and thus, of course, free association, and thus, of course, the right not to associate. And this right is robust because the league has the right to determine its members, its bylaws, what it will look like today, tomorrow, the day after that, etc. Okay. So this is just supposed to be like, a way of thinking about like why R1 would be true is by thinking about like just kind of an easy everyday kind of case, and we can multiply cases if we wanted to here. And now, more on R2. So if the golf league example is right, if it succeeds, the same idea could apply relevantly or would apply relevantly to states. Once it's seen that intimate relations are required, right, for free association to apply, or the right to self-determination, which of course then entails right to free association, and thus the right to then exclude, or apply robustly, then the latter right can readily apply to states, legitimate states are the relevant ones, of course. Okay, so so that's the reply to objection one. In a way, intimacy is irrelevant to whether or not um, the relevant self-determination, free association, and the right not to associate, whether or not those rights apply. Okay. So what about objection? The second objection. Here's how I'm capturing it on this slide. I call it a low impact objection. Free association applies to states or international institutions in relation to other states or international institutions. So think about like the Norway example again. So free association, so self-determination, free association, etc., applies in relation to Norway, to Sweden, and the EU. But there you just have states in relation to states or states in relation to international institutions, not to states or international institutions in relation to individuals or relevant individuals who here are foreigners, would be immigrants. And this is because individuals or foreigners by themselves don't have strong impact on a state or on a legitimate state. Okay, so a single individual doesn't make much impact on a state, okay, on a legitimate state. Okay, so that's why I call it the low impact objection. Of course, um, uh, Sweden in relation to Norway would have significant impact on it. The EU would have significant impact on Norway as well. So what are the replies to objection 2? So R1 for response 1. Consider Harvard and Microsoft. Okay, these are corporate entities. They're not political entities, but they're still corporate entities, and they're perhaps analogous enough to states for us to get the job done. Heath Wellman thinks. So consider Harvard and Microsoft. In these cases, impact might be small if an individual were to try to join them. And nevertheless, both Harvard and Microsoft have the right to exclude because of their right to self-determination and free association, etc., an individual from joining them. Okay, so a single individual coming in and going like, "Hey, I want to join Harvard," you know what I mean? Just because, well, they want to join the faculty or some prominent board. Well, they can't do that, even if the impact would be quite low. Same thing with going to Microsoft and saying, "Hey, I want to be a manager at Microsoft," or "I want to work in productions at Microsoft." Well, impact could be quite low, but still Microsoft has the right to self-determination, right to free association, the right to exclude such an individual from walking on, as it were. Okay, so that seems to be Heath Wellman's R1, or response 1 to the second objection. R2 is going to be the kind of this related point, is thinking about the case of immigration, in case you weren't sold on this immediately, but consider immigration from Mexico to the US, one that Heath Wellman considers. Sure, an individual immigrant won't make much of an impact on the US. Okay, but if weak impact has little or nothing to do with self-determination, then the US's right to self-determination seems well-founded. Okay, so it doesn't matter, as is shown in R1, that the impact would be low. The impact is irrelevant to whether or not the relevant entities, whether it's Harvard, a university, or a business like Microsoft, or a legitimate state having the right to exercise self-determination against single individuals. Okay, of course, and Heath Wellman makes this point in the paper. Sure, a single immigrant by himself may not, but if you have weak policies on this and the individuals pile up and add up, well, then the impact becomes great. Okay, then in that case, then it looks like a case could be made. Well, then, supposing even it's true that significant impact is what's required for exercising the right to self-determination, well, in that case, then states would have the right to exercise self-determination. Okay. Now, I don't, getting into current events, there are some people, I think very many people in the U.S., for example, who think that that's precisely what's happened with immigration during the Biden era, during the Biden presidency, wherein the southern border was um, very porous and allowed lots of illegal immigrants into our country. Um, and so much so that the impact has been great on many cities, sanctuary cities, and others. Uh, but anyways, that's sort of a current event point. These points can definitely be debated, but there are at least um, a large percentage of people in America, the United States of America, who think that that's the case. Okay, so there's more than what I say on the slide here that captures is part of what Heath Wellman wants to say in response to the second objection to his SDA. Now, keep in mind that um, it's a way of challenging the self-determination argument. And if this objection were to succeed, the argument would fail. But it looks like, at least initially, that Heath Wellman has done a good job defending his argument. Whether or not the argument succeeds because of that's another question. So now let's segue to open versus closed borders in that topic and discuss Heath Wellman's view. And you might say, well, that issue's already been kind of dealt with. He's arguing for the right to exclude would-be immigrants, legitimate states having that robust right. So it looks like he's on the closed border side of things, and that's what his view is. Okay, and that, in some sense, is his view. But if you notice, there was nuance. So um, after, again, dealing with the objections, he then on page 293, if this is helpful, he summarizes his discussion of the two potential objections. And then he goes on to deal with the issue of like really what his view is on the open versus closed borders topic. Okay. And again, there's subtlety here. So let's think first about rights and recommendations. Heathwood claims, this is again on the bottom of page 293, where he discusses the difference between a deontological right and a consequential recommendation, as it were. Okay. So Heath was arguing for a deontological right, as he calls it, rather than offering a consequential recommendation. So he's arguing for what a legitimate state has the right to do. Not saying that he's recommending that they do the relevant thing. Okay. So, like if it's helpful, think about a case like where you might say that, imagine you're giving an argument to your friend that that they have the right to date whomever they want. Um, or let's just make it more specific that you're talking to your friend and you say they have the right to date person X, let's say. So it'd be one thing to argue that they have the right to date the person whom they want to date, person X, let's say. But it's another thing to say that you'd recommend that they date that person. Okay. So hopefully that's a helpful kind of example to see the difference between what Heathwood's up to. He's arguing for legitimate states having the right to have closed borders policies. Legitimate states have the right to exclude. It's not the same thing as saying that he's recommending that they exclude. Okay, just like you might argue that your friend has the right to date so and so, but you're not saying I'm arguing that I recommend that you date that person because it might be for it might be for A, B, and C reasons that it would be bad or something like that. But they're just two separate projects in a way, aren't they? Okay, so hopefully that example helps. Continuing with just rights and recommendations here, it's just one thing to argue for a right to X and quite another to recommend that someone do X. Okay, I already captured that point. This is just put in abstract terms. And when it comes to a general recommendation on open versus closed borders, Heath Wellman, can I do better? Heath Wellman has no general recommendation, he claims. Okay, and I said, hold on. I said Heathwood here. There's another philosopher, Christopher Heathwood, that I study quite a bit. So apologies for that. So if we go back to the initial slide after open versus closed borders, slide 18, it's Heath Wellman, not Heathwood. So if you're confused by that, I apologize. It's Heath Wellman. Okay. They both do ethics. Uh, Heathwood does more ethics than Heath Wellman does, but I apologize. Um, so Heath Wellman has no general recommendation. So see page 294. Um, so he writes, there's several reasons I'm not comfortable making any recommendations as to how jealously, excuse me, states should guard their borders. First and most obviously, determining what immigration policy would be best for his country's citizens and or humanity as a whole requires knowledge of a great deal of detailed empirical information. Like you'd have to do a lot of studying, okay, of the relevant societies, their geopolitical situation or context in the world. Okay, um, that Heath Wellman claims he simply lacks. Just as importantly, though, it seems to me that there is unlikely to be any one size fits all prescription which would be appropriate for every country in the world to say this country should have open borders, this country should have closed borders, etc. Okay. On the contrary, there's no reason why a certain number and type of immigrants could not be beneficial in one country and yet quite harmful in another. It all depends on the particular cultural, social, economic, and political circumstances of the host country. So think about all the studying one would have to do to offer general recommendations. Consider, for instance, the economic impact of immigration. Well, so just focusing on the economic side of things. While some writers warn that opening a country's markets to outsiders will have potentially disastrous effects, others counter that the impact of open borders will, in the long run at least, invariably be beneficial. Okay. There's debates on the economic outcomes here. Okay, economic outcomes of immigration, of open borders versus closed borders. Okay, since removing any artificial boundary will allow the market to operate more efficiently. Okay, so by removing artificial barriers, by knocking down the borders, well, and you just allow the free market to prevail. Well, that might be overall beneficial. So free market. So many free market capitalists are on board with this kind of view. Okay, for an open borders view, they think that the world would be a lot richer. So we talked about Jason Brennan last week. Jason Brennan, free market capitalist, definitely thinks that. No, if you got that at the end of his paper, then well done. Um, so, so then he continues. I would guess, however, that the truth lies somewhere between these two polar positions, which is kind of a middle path. Um, Even if we restrict our focus exclusively to the economic impact upon those who are initially in the host state, as these debates often implicitly assume we should, how helpful any given influx of newcomers would be seems to me to depend on a number of factors, such as this country's antecedent level of unemployment and the types of skills and work ethic these immigrants have. Okay. So, anyways, because you can read more and more, I'm just trying to give you a flavor of why Heath Wellman doesn't have a general recommendation. And there he was just dealing with, one dimension of the issue, and that's going to be the economic impact. But there are other impacts that could be equally, if not more important, as he referenced the social, the political circumstances that will matter. So no general recommendation, but that said, he claims to lean more towards an open borders policy. So states have the right to have closed borders, but as it turns out, he says that he's going to lean more towards open borders policy than the status quo on the topic. So bottom page 294, he says, in light of these observations, I'm reluctant to recommend a specific immigration policy as the ideal solution for any given, let alone every state to follow. If forced to show my hand, however, I must confess that I would generally favor more open borders than the status quo. I appreciate that countries have a variety of good reasons to refrain from completely opening their borders, but I suspect that many of the world's current policies are more the result of unprincipled politicians exploiting the xenophobia and their constituents for short-term political gain than of well-reasoned assessments of what will be to the long-term advantage. Okay. And he goes on to say that this is not inconsistent with what he said before, because what he said before was about the deontological right point as opposed to the recommendation point. Okay. So those are just different issues that we've already talked about. Okay. So he leans open borders. So having the right to um, uh, close borders is different from um, the issue of whether or not, all things considered, the legitimate state should have closed borders or open borders for that matter. Okay, so now we're at that point, like where Heath Wellman's going to deal with the refugees argument, this sort of concluding argument that he deals with, because he realizes, okay, this would be a challenge to the idea that legitimate states have significant um, uh, uh, significant right to self-determination, free association, etc. Those refugees argument, as I understand it, would challenge once again that first premise uh, in SDA, in the self-determination argument, because it'd be a way of establishing a moral difference between individuals and legitimate states. Okay, so legitimate states are going to have this refugees problem that, well, individuals themselves don't have with respect to their right to self-determination, etc. Okay, so if you're trying to figure out where the refugees argument fits in, again, it's with respect to, let's go back to the argument, with respect to this first premise. Okay, and I try to anticipate that the controversial claim in the SDA sketch was this one about corporate political entities like legitimate states having um, the right to self-determination. Well, the refugees argument goes after it. Okay, goes after that premise, that first premise. So in a way, if you're thinking, gosh, it targets, let's go back. If you're thinking it targets three, well, um, three was an inclusion from one and two. So that means either one or two has to be wrong. Well, it's obviously not going to be two. So the challenge would have to be to one, wouldn't it? Remember, two was the uncontroversial case. Okay. Hopefully that shores some stuff up logically, and shores things up in terms of understanding the significance of this refugees argument in relation to, you might say, this master argument, this major argument, SDA, that Heath Wellman develops in this paper. So this refugees argument, and then Heath Wellman's replies. We'll talk about at least a couple of them. But here's the argument. I just kind of have it sketched simply. States have an obligation to admit refugees. So people fleeing, political, economic, social turmoil. Okay. So think about like genuine cases of refugees. It seems like legitimate states, they have an obligation to help those people. Okay. So then if states have an obligation to admit refugees, then states don't have a right to self-determination, right? Sometimes they don't have a robust right to self-determination, might be thought as a way of running the argument here, but we can just keep that the more simple claim: they don't have a right to self-determination. That is, they don't have a right to exclude would-be immigrants. Because remember, the right to self-determination entails having the right to free association, which entails right having to exclude. In this case, to exclude would-be immigrants. So then three follows from one and two, and logic. Okay, so you tell me what the rule of inference here is, what the logical rule here is. Modus ponens. Okay. Okay. So by one and two. So very straightforward argument. Okay. Of course, the idea would be something like, and I tried to capture this earlier on in my presentation, and the idea is that if states do have an obligation to admit refugees, then and this would mean that refugees have a right to to um, to enter other countries, right? To perhaps become citizens or otherwise be helped by um, uh, legitimate states. Okay, and so that would mean that their self-determination doesn't exist, or something like that. Maybe there's a weaker way of running the argument, which is just that the right self-determination is quite poor. Okay, and if it's quite poor, then then states wouldn't have a robust right to have closed borders, whatever your view or recommendation ends up being when dealing with that issue. Okay. So again, it's a way of challenging the idea that states have the right to, again, legitimate states have the right to self-determination, and thus the right to exclude would-be immigrants. Okay. So we have a couple different replies before we get to the end here. So we're close to wrapping things up on the Heath Wellman. So the first reply is states have the obligation to help refugees, but this doesn't entail that the states must admit them, nor does it entail that if refugees are admitted, then they are given past the citizenship. Okay, so it's right that states do have an obligation to help, but what that help amounts to doesn't have to mean admitting them into their state or even giving them the more robust thing by some path towards citizenship. Okay, so let's look at page 297, 298. So it says, bottom of page 297, yeah. I agree that the citizens of wealthy states are obligated to help refugees, but I'm not convinced that this assistance must come in the form of more open admissions. Just as we might send food and other resources to the world's poor, we can try to help persecuted foreigners in their home state. So we can help them just in their home state. Imagine that Iraqi Kurds request asylum in Norway, for instance. Assuming that these Kurds are in fact being persecuted, it is natural to conclude that Norway has no choice but to allow them to immigrate. But this conclusion is too hasty. It's too quick. While there would presumably be nothing wrong with welcoming these Iraqis into the Norwegian political community, there are other options if the Norwegians would prefer not to expand their citizenship. If Norway were able to protect these Kurds in their homeland, then creating a safe haven with a no-fly zone in northern Iraq, for instance, if then there would be nothing wrong with Norway assisting them in this fashion. Indeed, in many ways, helping in this manner seems preferable. The core point, I mean, people could then stay in their or their native country or the country that they're currently a citizen of. The core point, of course, is that if these persecuted Kurds have a right against Norwegians, and it's a general right to right to protection from their persecutors, not the more specific right to. Sorry, I'm reading that poorly. Let me try again. The core point, of course, is that if these persecuted Kurds have a right against Norwegians, if they have that right, it is a general right to protection from their persecutors, not the more specific right to refuge in Norway. Okay, if Norway provides these Kurds refuge in Iraq, then the Kurds cease to qualify as refugees and thus no longer have a special claim to migrate to Norway. Okay, so if the persecuted Kurds have a right against Norwegians, let's say, because Norwegians have an obligation to them as refugees, well, then of course, then there's a general right to help them. But the general right to help them isn't the same thing as giving the Kurds the right to citizenship or the right to enter Norway. Okay. Okay, good. So that's one major reply that he gives to the refugees argument. States have the obligation to help refugees, but it doesn't entail that it must admit them. Okay. In fact, in many cases, the best thing might be just to help people where they are. Okay, and maybe this prevent them from becoming refugees. It seems to be what Heath Wellman is claiming in that passage. And then R2, response two, really related to R1. And just because I'd have the obligation to have the baby left at my doorstep doesn't entail that I have to become the baby's foster parent, adoptive parent, etc. Okay, I don't have to, keep the baby that I find at my doorstep in my home permanently thereafter as a result of this unfortunate circumstance. So C298 and 299 is the baby left at the doorstep example is a famous one in ethics. But he just says this. He says, before closing, I like to return to the analogy of the baby on the doorstep. Because I think reflecting upon this domestic case actually confirms my analysis of refugees. Suppose then that I open my front door in the dead of winter and find a newborn baby wrapped in blankets. Clearly, I must bring the infant in from the cold. I've got to help this infant. I've got to help this baby. But it doesn't follow that I must then adopt the child and raise her as my own. Perhaps it would be permissible to do so, but it seems clear that I would not be required to incorporate this child into my family if I would prefer not to. This child has a right to a decent future, and its arrival on my doorstep may well obligate me to attend to her needs if I can find her a satisfactory home. But the child's valid claim not to be left out in the cold does not entail the entirely distinct right to permanent inclusion in my family. I thus conclude that the analogy between a refugee and a baby left on one's doorstep is both apt and instructive. In both cases, one can non voluntarily incur a stringent duty to help the imperiled individual. But just as one can satisfactorily discharge one's duty to the vulnerable child without permanently adopting it, becoming a foster parent, etc., a state can entirely fulfill its responsibility to the persecuted refugees without allowing them to immigrate into its political community. It might even allow them in for a time, but then have a plan towards their eventual leaving. Right? They're eventually leaving. The state. So if it's the Kurds, yeah, we'll accept the refugees here, but we're not giving you a path to citizenship. We'll help you because we have an obligation to do so, and you have the right to be helped in such circumstances, such dire circumstances as they were in. And there we go. That doesn't mean that the Norwegians have to say, okay, we're going to grant your citizenship here or get you on a path toward that. Okay. So that is the conclusion of the refugees argument. If Heath Wellman's discharged the objection and replied to it well enough, then it looks like his self-determination argument stands and is strong. But of course, we always need to remember, as a point of emphasis, that Heath Wellman thinks that his argument for the right for legitimate states' right to self-determination, right, does entail the right to exclude would-be immigrants, and thus does entail the right to have for legitimate states to have policies which involve having closed borders. That's perfectly consistent with it being the recommendation of a philosopher like Heath Wellman or another political advisor like Heath Wellman claiming, but you should have open borders. You have the right to, okay, but it would be best or good for you and good for your country if you had policies for open borders. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you for watching once again. And if you have any questions on anything I've said in this video, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to answer any of the questions you have. Take care and have a good night.